What is the difference between agnosticism and atheism? That sounds like a simple question, but that's because it is. So much so that you may be surprised to learn that there are those who think that there is not a difference between the two, or that there is overlap between the two. And that is because, unfortunately, there is so much misinformation surrounding these two terms that now this is a question people actually ask. So, what is the difference between agnosticism and atheism? Well, if you've just genuinely never read the definitions or had them explained to you, while I encourage you to stick around for the rest of this video, I won't waste your time lecturing you. Atheism is the disbelief in God or gods opposing theism, and agnosticism is the lack of belief in God or gods, or the belief that it is impossible to prove that there is a God. It is indifference to theism, where obviously in both definitions, theism is the belief in God. So an agnostic is someone who says something like, I don't know if God exists, I don't care whether or not God exists, I don't really think about whether or not God exists, or it's impossible to know whether or not God exists. But he would never say anything like, there isn't a God, or there likely isn't a God. An agnostic can only say, I don't believe in God, if the context behind the statement, I don't believe, means I lack belief, not I don't believe as in I actively disbelieve. So ultimately, it's lack of belief versus disbelief. As we're going to get into shortly, there are people online who refuse to accept the definition of atheist and agnostic. And it may seem arrogant to say, but this is why it's hard to take them seriously. There are a lot of people who would argue this point and say that disbelief is the lack of belief. Or vice versa. Honestly, I can't remember because it's just all incomprehensible nonsense to me. I think I've seen people say both, but whichever it is, it demonstrates a clear lack of understanding of both epistemology and categories. For example, if I ask, do you know what is in my hand? You either do know or you don't know. Yes, you could probably make inferences like your fist looks too tightly clenched for there to be anything there, so you are likely not holding anything. But even then, that's just what you think could be. You don't actually know. It's either A or not A, either known or unknown. But if I show you what's in my hand, if I show you that in my hand I have a piece of paper, then I can show you what is on this piece of paper and I can ask you questions like, what is this? The second question is only possible after the first and only after you know that there is a piece of paper. Because if you do not know what I have, you cannot know or have an opinion on what it is. Only after a knowledge claim is made can we have the fact that it is a Rorschach test or a range of opinions about what it is. Yes, you can say that it was always there ontologically, but we're talking about epistemology, or in this case, belief. First, you have to hold a belief. In that, it is a common dishonest tactic among atheists to act as though the rejection of the existence of God is not a belief, but it is. I can ask you the question, does God exist? And if your response is no, or even probably not, then you hold a position on that statement. The inability to give an answer is the only lack of belief. I think that there's probably not a God. Disbelief is not a type of I don't know, a lack of belief, or the other way around. And even if we assumed that this was somehow false, which it really can't be, the statement disbelief is the lack of belief, or the lack of belief is disbelief, doesn't really make any sense in terms of categories. Light blue is a type of blue, so in that it is blue, but not all types of blue. There are other shades of blue. Again, in the land of make-believe, maybe you can take agnostic and atheist and say that one is a subcategory of the other, but they cannot be equivalent such that you can ignore the distinction between atheist and agnostic. You could only believe that an atheist is a kind of agnostic or the other way around, which is what some try to argue based on terrible definitions. If these people watched this video, they would come along and tell me that these are just my definitions, and that Oxford, for example, defines atheist as a person who disbelieves or lacks belief in the existence of God or gods, and agnostic as a person who believes that nothing is known or can be known of the existence or nature of God, or of anything beyond material phenomena, a person who claims neither faith nor disbelief in God. But the issue with this is that dictionaries are not authoritative in and of themselves. Like, you do know that they don't actually decide what a word means, right? Dictionary.com covers this misunderstanding the best. A word doesn't become real when it is added to the dictionary. We add words to the dictionary because they're really used by real people in the real world. Dictionaries do not set language, they record language. If a dictionary contradicts common use, then you should simply throw it out, which we should, by all means, do here. If you go out and ask anyone, as I have, you will find out the vast majority of people outside of your little Reddit atheist bubble do not use agnostic and atheist interchangeably, or even that agnosticism is atheism. But even if we ignore that, going back to Oxford's definition, we would have to make several concessions. First, a semicolon is not an or statement, which means, in the case of agnostic, a person who claims neither faith nor disbelief in God contextualizes or is an addition to the statement prior. It is not an alternative to the statement prior. This must mean that an agnostic cannot be an atheist, but also can be an atheist. You see, agnosticism, neither faith nor disbelief, can belong to atheism, lacks belief, but it cannot belong to atheism, a person who disbelieves, because that violates the nor disbelief statement in agnosticism, which means that atheism is a type of agnosticism, and agnosticism is a type of atheism, and agnosticism and atheism are interchangeable, but atheism and agnosticism are not interchangeable because atheism is not a form of agnosticism, neither is it a form of atheism if you consider that agnosticism is a form of atheism, unless you consider agnosticism to contain agnosticism, and atheism contains both atheism as it intersects with agnosticism, but not agnosticism. In this case, agnosticism is a type of agnosticism, atheism is a type of agnosticism and atheism. However, atheism is just a type of atheism. Agnosticism and atheism are not interchangeable, but agnosticism and atheism kind of are, with the exception to the fact that atheism is atheism and agnosticism is agnosticism. And if all of that sounds like unnecessarily convoluted nonsense, that's because it is. If anyone tells you that that definition is correct, that person has an agenda. That is just a Reddit atheist who says something like, "Oh, well, I know I just said that God doesn't exist, but actually, guys, I'm agnostic." I mean, don't get me wrong, the convoluted nature and apparent self-contradiction of these definitions, by the strictest standards of proof, technically isn't enough to disprove these definitions. After all, a rose is a flower, but a rose is also the past tense of rise. And we don't see this as an explicit logical contradiction because we understand that even though the words are the same, the concepts are not. However, I should point out that this concession I'm making doesn't really mean much. I'm basically just saying that if linguistic premises have no logical obligations, then we can't say that these definitions are logically wrong. If, on the other hand, you believe that language has some logical obligations, and at least that language needs to represent real things, then all we have to do is revisit the epistemological flowchart. Do you have a position on whether or not God exists? No, then that is a unique ideological group which we can call agnostic. If yes, do you believe in God? No, then you're an atheist. And also, we can say, however, that if language has no logical obligations, then surely at least it has prescriptive or purposeful ones. Isn't language meant to convey messages? If that's the case, then shouldn't we strive to convey our messages in meaningful ways? Sure, language can be confusing and full of homonyms and double meanings, but that doesn't mean it has to be. If language is what the majority decides, then the majority can decide to avoid unnecessary confusion. And in that, I can say that my definition is used by the majority, it makes logical sense, and it is the most meaningful way to convey these concepts in order to disambiguate them and make everyone's positions clear, whereas the points in your favor are, it is something you read online, and words can mean what we want them to. Okay. It's hard to accept that position, especially when the vast majority of Reddit atheists who make this argument don't really believe the lies that they spew. If I point out a rose and I say, this does not mean the past tense of rise, this is a rose, you would have no argument. But if I reference an atheist and say that this person is not someone who lacks belief, but someone who disbelieves, suddenly now you would try to argue that an atheist can lack belief or disbelieve. But no, in this instance, I am referencing an atheist, disbelief, not an atheist lacks belief. I can say atheist, disbelief, disbelieves, and does not lack it because you cannot eat your cake and have it too. Atheist as a word can only pair to the concept of disbelief and lack of belief if these are more like two separate words like rose and rose. If you, however, link these two concepts together claiming that they are one, that is no longer a linguistic ambiguity, that's a logical contradiction. So I get to talk all day long about how atheists are not people who lack belief but who disbelieve, and you can never tell me that I'm wrong. Sure, maybe you can passive-aggressively say, but atheist is also a term for lack of belief. But that just highlights the intent behind your action and gets us as close to disproving these definitions as we can possibly come. Sure, rose is the past tense of rise, and a rose is a flower, in which we can use context to differentiate. But what if rose meant got up and did not get up? That's what you're arguing for if you argue that atheist and agnostic can have any degree of overlap. If I say John is an atheist, that can't really be disambiguated through context if they are used in essentially the same context. The only thing that could disambiguate it is subtext. It would be the foresight in knowing that the word we use should convey the message rather than trying to force it to be the other way around. If rose meant rose and did not rise, an intelligent and honest person would use one of these meanings but not both. For example, that person would say John rose from the bed, but yesterday he was so sick that he did not get up. He would not say John rose and then say rose again for did not rise. So here you have it, that the honest and intelligent use of these terms is that an agnostic is someone who neither believes nor disbelieves, and an atheist is someone who disbelieves. So that wraps it up for this video. Go ahead and like and what's that? Reddit atheists are the most intellectually dishonest group of people on the face of this entire earth, so they invented an entire chart that I now have to cover in addition to proving that agnostic and atheist are two different terms. Fun! So I may eventually come back to this and make another video because it is alarming how much this blatant misinformation has spread, but just for the sake of leaving no question unanswered here in this video, no, there is no such thing as agnostic atheist or anything else that comes from this nonsensical Gnostic-Theism chart. I'll keep this brief because if you glance at the chart and use so much as an ounce of brainpower, you should be able to piece together why this chart is not just linguistically weak, but logically unsustainable. Versions of this chart will claim that an agnostic atheist, for example, is someone who does not believe any gods exist, but also doesn't claim to know that no gods exist. But this is impossible. You can't believe something and then make no claim of knowledge because belief is a claim of knowledge, just a weak one. If you ask me, is there ketchup in the fridge, and I respond back, I believe so, that doesn't imply I am worshipping the ketchup, that I have ketchup Bible studies. This is why I say this is all a problem with Reddit atheists, because whether it's the refusal to see disbelief as belief or now differentiating between belief and knowledge, these militant atheists want to change the definition of belief, generally making it something negative, and change the definition of knowledge, generally making it empirical and dogmatic. But here is why I say, unlike the previous argument, this is something we can 100% conclude is illogical, because it doesn't matter what definitions we operate under. For example, let's take the Gnosticism of this scale. We can assume that Gnosticism either means, I think I know that this is true, I know that this is true, or what it actually means, I have personal and mystical knowledge of this being true. Let's start with that one first, because it basically undermines this entire concept when you realize that the Redditor who made this scale doesn't know Greek. Gnosis means spiritual knowledge, or esoteric knowledge, or awareness. In that, its closest equivalent in English is probably enlightenment. For example, you can look up several essays comparing Buddhism and Gnosticism, or just in general learn that some academics will label Buddhism as a Gnostic religion. This is because Gnosticism in theology is in no way, shape, or form related to what we consider knowledge today. Gnosticism generally refers to Gnostic Christians, like the Valentinians, which I'm not even going to try to explain here, so go watch a video on that by someone else for now, if you're interested in that. Just suffice it to say that they believed in really weird, spiritual, esoteric stuff, so that's what Gnosticism means. It's just weird, esoteric enlightenment stuff. It doesn't mean personal, but somehow still academic knowledge of God. That isn't a thing and you can't make it a thing. If in this chart Gnosticism means what it actually means, or at the very least is close to what it actually means, then Gnostic atheist is not a viable position. You cannot have a religious experience with nothing. And so with that being the case, there's no need to say agnostic atheist, as if there's any other sort of atheist to disambiguate it from. All that would exist is what actually exists. Theists who have had what they believe are religious experiences, and theists who did not, as well as, obviously, atheists who did not have religious experiences. But again, that's just one possible conclusion. It doesn't really matter what Gnosticism means here. If we pretend that it can mean knowledge like this chart claims that it does, then that leads us to the age-old epistemological question, what is true knowledge? Can people say they know things even if those things are not true so long as they are confident by some quote-unquote objective standard? Or is that standard not objective if it can be wrong? Is true knowledge, well, true? Well, if in order to say that you know something, it must be true, then it still cannot be the case that this chart works. Gnostic-Theist and Gnostic-Atheist cannot coexist because both of them cannot be correct at the same time. If our claims of knowledge must be true in order for it to be knowledge, then God cannot exist and not exist in the same way and at the same time to answer the same question differently for different people. But if we say that knowledge is not based on truth, but somehow on certainty that is apparently not too good at being certain, then what standard is it based on? Again, it can't be something like academic certainty, because it's not as though the academic consensus would be that God exists and does not exist at the same time. And it cannot be personal logic, because that's an oxymoron. If something is logical in an objective sense, then it is not personal, because that's the definition of objective. And as we just said, for objective truth, it cannot be the case that two people know contradictory things. So it isn't really knowledge, it is knowledge based on, say it with me now, personal belief. Secular dogmatists may try to argue that you can believe it is impossible to prove something, but believe one way or another, but the inclination to accept this just stems from their dogma, which has eaten away at the world's collective common sense. If I believe in something, in whatever regard, whether it's a Gnostic or spiritual experience or a logical argument, then I clearly believe that it has been proven, however strongly or weakly, to me. My acknowledgement that I cannot convince other people or prove it outside of my own experiences does not mean that I don't think that I know for myself. So you can't have this scale of, I believe I don't know, but I believe I know. It's all just a matter of belief, and this Gnostic scale is just identity politics nonsense. I mean, don't get me wrong, obviously an atheist could have a strong disbelief or a weak disbelief, and the opposite is true for a theist. And so some will argue that this is the true application of this scale, and that it still holds. But the technical term for that is, copium. Because again, you're just clearly ignoring how obvious it is that this scale was just made up by some 15-year-old who just went, well, I think agnosticism is when people don't know, so that must mean Gnosticism is when people know. First off, not only is this obviously the case because of everything I just said about the true definition, etymology, and history of the term Gnosticism, but also consider how much this misrepresents agnosticism. Do you think all agnostics are weak agnostics who just sit on the fence and don't know what to believe? Or is it the case that all definitions also have it that an agnostic can be someone who believes that it is impossible to know whether or not God exists? And can someone not have a strong belief in that claim? Agnosticism is not something you can appropriate to make your own ideology sound cool as an axis on some silly chart you made. While we may say that weak atheism and weak theism are closer to agnosticism, they are not agnostic. The fungal kingdom, for example, sits between the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. That doesn't mean we have a fungi-animal scale. We understand the taxonomy of life as a dividing branch. Likewise, the best model for theology begins with the question of whether or not you have a position on the existence of God, and whether or not God exists. And in that, if you believe in God or gods, then you are a theist. If you believe that God doesn't exist or that gods don't exist, then you are an atheist. But if you just don't know what to think, or you think that it is impossible to prove whether or not God exists, then you are an agnostic. And it's really just that simple.